Have you ever been sitting at the dinner table with someone you love and felt completely alone? Have you ever asked the person next to you how their day was and gotten a one-word answer, a shrug, or just silence, and felt something cold crawl up your spine? Not because they were tired, not because they were distracted, but because something between you had already died, and nobody had announced the funeral yet. St. Teresa of Avila knew that feeling. She wrote about it in ways that cut to the bone. She called it the soul's great desert, a place where no voice reaches and no warmth comes. And she said it was more terrifying than any demonic temptation she had ever faced, because at least in a spiritual battle, you know you are still fighting. In the silence of a broken relationship, you're not even sure you exist to the other person anymore. What Teresa saw in the spiritual life mirrors something that researchers, marriage counselors, psychologists, and ordinary people living inside quiet households have been documenting for decades. The moment the conversation stops, truly stops, not pauses, but stops, the relationship begins to die. Not loudly, not with a fight, with a whisper, with a question nobody answers, with a table set for two and no real words exchanged for 3 years. This is that story. If you find this kind of deep and honest content valuable, subscribe right now. It genuinely is the best way to support what we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you are tuning in from. We want to know where you are. This script draws from Teresa of Avila's own writings, specifically The Interior Castle, written in 1577, and the book of her life, completed around 1565, cross-referenced with the landmark research of Dr. John Gottman of the University of Washington, whose 40-year longitudinal study of couples at the Love Lab in Seattle, Washington, produced some of the most precise and documented data on relationship collapse ever assembled. When Teresa and Gottman say the same thing 600 years apart, you stop and listen. Now back to the story. Teresa of Avila was born on March 28, 1515, in Avila, Spain, a walled city sitting at around 3,700 feet above sea level, cold even in summer, the kind of place where silence has weight. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation at the age of 20. In 1535, not out of some mystical calling at first, but partly out of fear of hell, and partly out of the exhaustion of a life that was already fracturing under her. Her mother had died when Teresa was only 12. Her father was emotionally distant. Her early years at the convent were marked not by peace, but by what she later described as a spiritual drought that lasted nearly 20 years. 2 decades of going through the motions. 2 decades of prayer that felt like shouting into an empty room. She called this period her years of divided life. She was performing the rituals, attending the hours, reading the texts, and feeling absolutely nothing in return. And she wrote, with brutal honesty, that she nearly abandoned the interior life entirely because the silence from heaven felt indistinguishable from rejection. That is important. That is not a metaphor. That is the lived experience of someone who kept showing up and kept hearing nothing back. Sound familiar? Because that is exactly what happens in a marriage, in a friendship, in a family, in any relationship, where one person keeps showing up and the other person has gone somewhere else inside themselves. You keep asking. You keep trying. And the answers that come back are shorter and shorter until one day you realize you have not had a real conversation in 6 months. And you cannot remember when it stopped. You only know it stopped. Gottman calls this the beginning of the distance and isolation cascade. It is one of the 4 predictors he identified, the ones he calls the 4 horsemen, that, when present, allow him to predict divorce with an accuracy rate of around 90%. The 4 horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. But the one that comes last, stonewalling, is the one that looks most like silence, the one that looks most like an empty chair at the table, the one that looks most like 2 people living in the same house but occupying entirely different worlds. Stonewalling is not an argument. It is the end of arguments. It is when one person shuts down completely, goes cold, gives one-syllable answers or no answers at all, and creates what researchers describe as a physiological shutdown state, a measurable drop in engagement where the heart rate paradoxically lowers, the face goes blank, and the person becomes essentially unreachable. Teresa described the spiritual equivalent with terrifying precision. In The Interior Castle, written when she was 62 years old and already battling serious illness, she described souls who had moved into the outer rooms of the castle and could not or would not move deeper. She wrote that these souls were not bad people. They were people so overwhelmed by noise, by obligations, by the sheer exhaustion of daily life, that they had stopped going inward at all. They were existing entirely on the surface, performing their duties, saying the right words, and feeling nothing. She did not condemn them. She mourned them, because she knew what it cost to live like that. And here's the detail that shatters you if you sit with it. Teresa said that the worst suffering in that outer room was not the absence of consolation. It was the absence of communication. The soul was not being punished. It was simply not being heard. And when a soul stops feeling heard, it starts to wither, not with drama, with silence. Gottman published his first major findings in 1992 in a paper with Dr. Neil Jacobson. By 2002, his research had tracked 130 couples over a 14-year period and found that the single most reliable predictor of a relationship's destruction was not how often couples fought. It was whether they turned toward or away from each other during ordinary daily bids for connection. Bids for connection. That is the technical term. A bid is any attempt to connect, however small. How was your day? Is a bid. Did you see the sunset? Is a bid. I'm tired, said out loud to a partner instead of just silently to yourself, is a bid. Gottman found that couples who stayed together turned toward each other's bids 86% of the time. Couples who divorced turned toward each other only 33% of the time. That gap between 86 and 33 is where marriages live or die. Not in the big fights, in the small moments, in the question asked and not answered, in the observation offered and not acknowledged, in the silence that fills the space where a voice should have been. Teresa said almost the same thing about prayer in 1565. She wrote that people abandon the interior life not because of great sins, but because of small neglects. They stop speaking inwardly, they stop listening, they stop turning toward. And the relationship between the soul and God does not die in a crisis. It dies in the accumulated weight of 1,000 tiny moments of turning away. Cold, quiet, gone. There's a specific year in Teresa's life where this becomes physical, not just spiritual. In 1539, at the age of 24, she collapsed while at the convent and fell into what contemporaries described as a coma lasting 4 days. Her father refused to let her be buried because he believed she was still alive. She came back. But she came back partially paralyzed, dragging herself on her hands and knees for 3 years before she recovered her mobility. And she described the experience of those 3 years, unable to move, dependent on others, largely ignored by the spiritual world around her, as the closest she ever came to understanding what a soul feels when it is trapped inside a relationship where it can no longer move. She wrote, "I was like someone buried alive. I could see, I could hear, I could not reach." That line is not devotional poetry. That is a clinical description of what it feels like to be in a relationship where communication has fully collapsed. You are present, you're conscious, you're completely isolated. Researchers at the University of Michigan, in a 2010 study published in Social Psychological and Personality Science, found that people who experienced chronic social disconnection, not isolation from all humans, but specifically from the people they expected to be close to, showed physiological stress responses nearly identical to those produced by physical pain. The brain regions that activate when you're excluded from a conversation are the same ones that activate when you stub your toe. The pain of being ignored by someone who should see you is not metaphorical. It is neurological. Teresa knew this without an fMRI machine. She described the inner life of a person being spiritually ignored as being pressed from all sides without being touched. You feel the pressure everywhere. The source is nowhere visible, and you cannot explain to anyone else why you are in agony because nothing has actually happened. Nothing has happened. That is the most accurate description of this kind of suffering. Nothing has happened. Nobody hit you. Nobody left. Nobody said anything cruel. Nothing happened. And somehow the nothing is crushing you. This is the silence Teresa saw. This is the emptiness she named. Not the dramatic silence of the mystic's dark night, where the soul wrestles with God and knows it is wrestling. The ordinary silence. The domestic silence. The silence of a kitchen where 2 people are eating, and no real words have been exchanged in long enough that neither person can remember what it feels like when they were. In the interior castle, Teresa describes 7 dwelling places inside the soul, 7 concentric rooms leading toward the innermost chamber where union with God occurs. And she is very specific about what blocks passage from the 3rd dwelling place to the 4th. The 3rd dwelling is the dwelling of order, of routine, of people who do everything right. They pray, they give, they serve, they are, in every external measure, model souls, and they are completely stuck. Because they have mastered the performance of connection without experiencing the substance of it. She wrote that these souls were the most difficult to help because they did not know they were lost. They had confused order with intimacy. They had confused presence with closeness. They did everything together and felt nothing together and genuinely did not understand the difference. That is not a spiritual problem exclusive to convents in 16th century Spain. That is every long-term relationship where the couple has built a functional life together and lost the actual relationship inside it. They coordinate schedules. They parent together. They split bills. They appear from the outside to be fine. And inside the house, when the door closes, there's nothing there. Just the echo of a life that used to feel alive. Gottman documented this exact dynamic in a study group he called the Masters and the Disasters of Relationships. The disasters were not the couples who fought the most. They were the couples who had stopped engaging, who answered questions with facts instead of feelings, who had learned to coexist at maximum efficiency and minimum contact. Their households ran. Their hearts had gone dark. The Masters, by contrast, were not perfect. They argued. They got irritated. They had bad days. But they kept turning toward. They kept asking. They kept answering. Even imperfectly, even badly, they kept the channel open. Teresa's word for keeping the channel open was perseverance. She returned to it obsessively. In the book of her life, she wrote the sentence that became, arguably, her most famous instruction on prayer. The most important thing is to begin. Do not stop. Do not withdraw. Persevere. And she said that the value of perseverance was not that it always produced consolation. Sometimes it produced nothing. She prayed for years and felt nothing. But perseverance kept the direction. It kept the face turned toward rather than away. And she said, with the clarity of someone who had nearly given up twice, that direction matters infinitely more than progress. You do not have to feel close. You have to keep turning toward. Gottman says the same thing with different vocabulary. He found that the effective quality of a bid, meaning whether it was delivered warmly or coldly or even grumpily, mattered far less than whether the bid was made and received. Couples who turned toward each other's bids, even awkwardly, even imperfectly, even when one person was tired and the other was distracted, maintained their bond. The content of the conversation was almost irrelevant. The consistency of the turning was everything. How was your day? Is not a small question. It is a direction. It is a face turned toward. And when it stops, and when the person on the other side stops turning back, something begins to die that is very difficult to revive. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Gottman's research found that by the time a couple reaches a therapist's office for the first time, they have typically been struggling with the same core issues for an average of 6 years before seeking help. 6 years. 2,190 days, roughly, of not turning toward, of questions that got shorter, of answers that got shorter, of silences that got longer. 6 years of slow erosion before anyone said the word help out loud. Teresa waited almost 20 years. 20 years of performing the interior life without experiencing it. And then, at the age of 40, in 1555, something broke open. She was kneeling before a statue of Christ at the pillar, a depiction of Christ before his scourging. And she felt, she wrote, that she could no longer stand to be in such bad company, meaning her own company, her own divided, distracted, surface-level self. She wept. Not prettily. She described it as the weeping of someone who has been lying and knows it. And after the weeping, something shifted. The silence changed. It was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of someone listening, not the silence of someone gone. She wrote, everything changed, not because I prayed better, but because I finally stopped pretending I was not alone. That is the turn. That is the moment. Not when you fix it. When you stop pretending it is not broken. This matters enormously in the context of relationships. Because one of the things Gottman found, documented in his 2011 book, The Science of Trust, was that the couples who recovered, who pulled back from the edge of disaster, were almost universally couples where at least one person was able to name the disconnection honestly without blame. Not, you never talk to me, not, you make me feel invisible, but the raw, terrifying, humbling sentence that goes something like, I feel like we have lost each other and I am scared and I miss you. That sentence is very hard to say. It requires you to admit need. It requires you to admit fear. It requires you to take down the wall that you built partly in self-defense and admit that you built it and that you are willing to take it down even though you are not sure what you will find on the other side. Teresa called this the prayer of humility. Not humility as self-deprecation. Humility as accuracy. Seeing yourself as you actually are, seeing the relationship as it actually is, not as it is supposed to be, not as you perform it to be, but as it actually is at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday when nobody is watching, and the silence in the house is so thick you could press it between your palms. Let us talk about what happens in the body when this silence takes hold, because Teresa described the physical symptoms too, and they match the clinical literature with an accuracy that is either coincidence or she was simply a better observer of human nature than most researchers with funding. Teresa described the state of the soul trapped in disconnection as experiencing heaviness of spirit, inability to move toward good, a kind of numbness that makes even what used to bring joy feel flat, and a persistent low-grade dread that something is permanently wrong even if nothing visible has changed. That is the clinical description of what psychologists now call relational depression. Not major depressive disorder necessarily, though it can develop into that, but a specific state of chronic low-grade despair that arises not from chemical imbalance alone, but from the sustained experience of being in close proximity to someone and feeling profoundly unseen by them. A 2016 study published in the Journal of Family Psychology found that individuals in relationships characterized by low emotional responsiveness, meaning their partner rarely turned toward their bids, regularly acknowledged their emotional states, or demonstrated what researchers call attunement, showed cortisol levels over a 30-day tracking period, consistent with individuals experiencing chronic mild stress. Not catastrophic stress, chronic mild stress. The kind that is not dramatic enough to name. The kind that just slowly, incrementally, wears the body down. Teresa called it the slow fire, not a blaze. A slow fire that burns without flame and without smoke and leaves nothing but ash where something warm once was. The interior castle was written in 1577 under instruction from Teresa's confessor, Father Gracian, who told her to sit down and describe the life of the soul as clearly as she could. She sat down. She wrote it in approximately 2 months, while managing the administrative demands of a rapidly expanding network of Reformed Carmelite convents while in poor health, while under scrutiny from the Spanish Inquisition, which had been watching her mystical claims with considerable suspicion since at least 1575. She wrote it under pressure, in poor health, with external forces threatening to invalidate everything she was saying, and she still managed to produce one of the most psychologically precise documents in the history of Western spiritual writing. The reason the interior castle endures is not because it is mystical. It is because it is accurate. The reason it maps onto Gottman's research 6 centuries later is because Teresa was studying the same thing Gottman was studying. The interior conditions that allow two beings to remain in genuine contact with each other, and the interior conditions that cause that contact to collapse. The word she used most often in describing the failing of the third dwelling place was preoccupied. The souls there were preoccupied. With virtue, with duty, with correct behavior, with looking good and being good and doing good. And in all of that preoccupation, they had simply run out of interior space to actually be present to the one they were supposedly in relationship with. They were too busy being in relationship to be in relationship. That is the trap that every long-term couple, every long-term friendship, every parent-child dynamic eventually faces. The relationship becomes a managed project. There are tasks, there are roles, there are scripts for the common interactions. How was your day? Becomes a ritual, not a question. And fine becomes an answer, not a report. And both people know, somewhere below the surface, that something has been replaced with its own performance, but they do not stop. Because stopping would mean admitting, and admitting would mean feeling. And feeling in the state of advanced disconnection feels too dangerous to risk. Teresa stopped. At 40, kneeling before the Christ at the pillar, she stopped the performance, and she said that the price of that stop was enormous. She felt, she wrote, that she was dying. Not metaphorically. She felt that by finally telling the truth about her own emptiness, she was annihilating the version of herself she had carefully built over 20 years. And she was right. She was. The woman who rose from that floor was not the woman who knelt down, because the woman who knelt down had been managing her relationship with God. The woman who rose had given up managing and started actually reaching. Gottman's data on repair attempts is one of the most quietly revolutionary findings in the study of human relationships. A repair attempt is any action, word, gesture, or behavior that attempts to de-escalate a conflict or reconnect after a period of distance. It can be as small as touching someone's arm during an argument. It can be as small as saying, "I'm sorry, I'm being defensive." It can be as small as making eye contact and holding it a half second longer than usual. Gottman found that the success rate of repair attempts was not determined primarily by the quality of the repair attempt. It was determined by the health of the relationship underneath the repair attempt. In strong relationships, even clumsy repair attempts landed, because the person receiving the repair attempt had enough goodwill accumulated to recognize the reaching, even when the reaching was awkward. In relationships characterized by contempt, the most successful repair attempt in the world failed, because contempt had so thoroughly corroded the foundation that reaching felt like manipulation or weakness or too little too late. The foundation matters more than the repair, and the foundation is built not in the dramatic moments, but in the daily accumulation of turning toward. Every "how was your day?" answered with genuine interest. Every "I'm tired" received without dismissal. Every small bid met with a small turning toward. These are the bricks of the foundation. They are not glamorous. They are not the stuff of love songs. They are the stuff of actual love. Teresa wrote that the great mystic experiences, the visions, the locutions, the raptures she experienced beginning in 1555 were not the substance of her relationship with God. They were, she wrote, more like gifts left on a doorstep. Surprising, moving, proof of something. But the relationship itself was built in the ordinary interior turning, in the daily act of choosing, however tiredly, however distractedly, to face inward rather than outward, to say the name, to ask the question, to wait for the answer. The relationship was built in the 5 a.m. prayer that felt like nothing, in the noon examination of conscience done hastily between obligations, In the moment before sleep, when the mind was exhausted, and the spirit still whispered one more turn toward before going dark. That is the relationship, not the rapture. The turning, daily, small, consistent, irreplaceable. There is a detail from Teresa's biography that most people skip over because it does not fit the mystical narrative. In 1572, she was ordered by her superior to return to the convent of the Incarnation in Avila as prioress, the very convent where she had spent those lost 20 years. She did not want to go. The community did not want her there. When she arrived on October 6, 1572, the nuns locked themselves in their cells and refused to come out. Some of them wept. Some of them shouted. The tension was so severe that a local authority had to be called to manage the reception. Teresa walked in anyway. She placed an image of Our Lady in the prioress's chair and knelt beside it. She said to the assembled, resistant, furious community, "Ladies, I have come not to command you, but to serve you and to learn from each of you." And then she stayed for 5 years. She served them. She learned from them. She rebuilt, slowly, painfully, without drama, the fractured web of trust inside that community. She repaired relationships that had been broken for decades, not through confrontation, through daily, patient, unrelenting turning toward. By 1577, when she left, the community wept again, but this time for the opposite reason. That is a document of repair. 1572 to 1577. 5 years, one woman, one choice, made daily, to keep turning toward people who had initially turned away. Gottman's highest functioning couples, the masters, showed something similar in their conflict patterns. When he measured their physiological responses during arguments, he found that the masters maintained lower heart rates, less cortisol flooding, and higher rates of what he called positive sentiment override, meaning even during conflict, they were able to perceive their partner's negative behavior against a background of overall goodwill. They could hear criticism without hearing contempt. They could sit in disagreement without feeling abandoned, because the accumulated weight of thousands of daily turnings toward had built something underneath the conflict that the conflict could not destroy. The disasters had the opposite. Every conflict activated what he called negative sentiment override. Every negative behavior was perceived as evidence of the partner's fundamental bad character. Every silence was evidence of rejection. Every raised voice was evidence of the end, because there was nothing underneath. The daily turnings had stopped too long ago. The foundation had gone. Cold, hollow, gone. Here is what Teresa wrote about recovery, because she wrote about it. In the sixth dwelling place, which she described as the most painful of all, the soul experiences what she called the intense suffering of nearness. It has moved deeper into the castle. It can feel the nearness of something real. And that nearness is agony, because the gap between where you are and where you need to be becomes unbearably visible. She wrote that many souls, upon entering the sixth dwelling, turned back, because the pain of seeing clearly how far you have drifted is, in the short term, worse than the numbness of not seeing at all. This maps onto the clinical phenomenon known as the intimacy activation paradox, documented by researchers, including Dr. Sue Johnson, founder of emotionally focused therapy and author of Hold Me Tight, published in 2008. Johnson found that the moment a distant partner begins to re-engage, the pain in the relationship often intensifies before it gets better, because the re-engagement opens what the distance had been protecting against: the longing, the grief, the accumulated loss of all the years when the turning away was the norm. And many couples, at precisely the moment where recovery is becoming possible, retreat, because the pain of beginning to feel again is more acute than the pain of the long numbness. Teresa called this the dark night of the soul in the sixth dwelling, and she said, with the authority of someone who had been there, "Do not leave. The pain is proof of proximity. The ache is evidence that you're getting closer. Stay." Johnson says the same in clinical terms. The tears that come when a stonewalling partner finally says, "I hear you, I'm here," are not the tears of damage. They are the tears of thaw, of something that was frozen beginning, painfully, to move again. The question is always the same. Will you stay for the thaw, or will the pain of beginning to feel again drive you back behind the wall? There is one final detail from Teresa's life that closes this in a way no summary could. On October 4th, 1582, Teresa of Avila died in Alba de Tormes, Spain, at the age of 67. She had been traveling. She had been ill for weeks. She had been managing correspondence, dealing with administrative crises, navigating the fractured internal politics of the Reformed Carmelites she had spent her life building. She died in the arms of one of her sisters, a woman named Ana de San Bartolomé, who had served as Teresa's personal secretary and caretaker for years. Ana de San Bartolomé later recorded, in her own memoir, that Teresa's last words were spoken quietly, conversationally, as if she were simply continuing a dialogue that had been running for decades. She said, "My lord, it is time to move on. Let thy will be done. O my lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for is come. It is time to meet," not a proclamation. A greeting. The words of someone who had been in a conversation for 40 years and was simply arriving, finally, at the face of the one she had been turning toward all along. The silence she had feared at 20. The silence that had nearly broken her at 40. The silence she had learned painfully, daily, to interpret not as absence, but as the quiet of something real. That silence, at the end, was not empty. It never was. In 2017, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, analyzing 40 years of data from the Berkeley Longitudinal Study, found that individuals who reported high-quality conversational intimacy with at least one other person, specifically the quality of feeling genuinely heard and genuinely interested, not just the frequency of interaction, lived an average of 7.5 years longer than those who reported chronic relational disconnection. 7.5 years. Not from diet, not from exercise, from the experience, sustained over time, of someone turning toward you and meaning it. 7 years. The span of a childhood. The span of a presidency. The span of enough time to change everything that needs changing, if you start now. The most expensive silence in the world is the one sitting across from you at dinner. The one that answers, "How was your day?" with "Fine." The one that used to tell you everything and now tells you nothing. That silence does not have to be permanent, but it will become permanent the way all silences do, if nobody turns toward it and refuses to let it stay. Teresa turned toward it in 1555, kneeling on stone, weeping before a suffering Christ. At 40 years old, 20 years behind where she should have been. And from that turn, she built the rest of her life. 17 reformed convents, 2 major spiritual masterworks, a reformation of an entire religious order, a relationship, documented in her own hand, that she described until her last breath as the truest thing she had ever found. It started with a turn. Just that. Just the willingness to stop performing connection and start attempting it, to stop answering with one syllable and start answering with the truth, to stop asking the question as a ritual and start asking it as a real question and waiting, actually waiting for a real answer. The interior castle, completed in 1577, was found among Teresa's manuscripts after her death. It had been written on loose sheets in her famously difficult handwriting, surrounded by administrative notes and half-finished letters. The manuscript was nearly lost. Father Gracian preserved it. It was published for the first time in 1588, 6 years after her death. It has not been out of print since. She wrote it in 2 months. While sick, while under surveillance by the Inquisition, while running a religious reformation, she wrote it because someone who loved her asked her to describe, as clearly as she could, what the soul looks like from the inside. She did. She told the truth. Every dwelling place, every obstacle, every place where souls get stuck, not because they are bad, but because they stop turning toward. And the ones who stopped turning toward did not do it in a single dramatic moment. They did it slowly. They did it daily. They did it in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small turnings away, until the silence was so complete they could no longer remember what the voice of the thing they loved actually sounded like. That is the story. That is the warning. That is the invitation. There is something that happens in the body when the silence lifts. Researchers at the HeartMath Institute in Boulder Creek, California, have been measuring it since 1991, when 2 people experience what the researchers call heart coherence during genuine conversation, meaning their physiological rhythms actually synchronize, their heart rate variability patterns shift, their cortisol drops, and something measurable in both nervous systems settles in a way that no medication has yet replicated. The body knows when it is being spoken to. The body knows when it is being heard. And the body, in the absence of that, does not rest. It waits. It braces. It holds itself slightly clenched against the possibility that the next silence will be permanent. Teresa described this as the soul's vigilance. She wrote that a soul deprived of genuine communion with what it loves cannot fully rest. It stays in a kind of suspended readiness, a low-grade watchfulness, which she described as exhausting beyond measure. Not the exhaustion of labor, the exhaustion of being perpetually on alert for something that does not come. She knew this exhaustion personally. She wrote about it with the specificity of someone who had logged the hours. In the book of her life, she described years when she would enter the chapel for prayer and feel what she called a great repugnance, not hatred of prayer, a deep resistance that she could not name and could not overcome by willpower alone. She sat there anyway. She resisted the resistance, and she wrote that those years of sitting in resistance, showing up to a conversation that felt one-sided and hollow, were ultimately the years that built the capacity for everything that came after. The parallel for human relationships is almost too precise to be comfortable. Relationship researchers at the University of Denver, including Dr. Scott Stanley and Dr. Howard Markman, published findings in 2012 showing that the single strongest behavioral predictor of long-term relational satisfaction was what they called dedication commitment, the internal sense of choosing the relationship, not because leaving feels too hard, but because staying feels like the right direction. Couples with high dedication commitment reported higher rates of working through periods of disconnection, not because the disconnection hurt less, because they had a framework for enduring it without interpreting it as the end. Teresa called this framework hope, not optimism. Hope. Optimism says things will get better. Hope says the direction is still worth maintaining even when better has not arrived yet. It is a subtle difference with enormous practical consequences. Optimism collapses when the evidence stops supporting it. Hope does not require supporting evidence. It only requires direction. And direction, Teresa argued, was the one thing that even the most spiritually exhausted soul could choose, even when it felt like nothing, even when it produced nothing, even when the silence on the other side remained exactly the silence it had been the day before. Keep turning toward, even badly, even tiredly, even clumsily. Keep the face pointed in the right direction. Let the rest sort itself out. This is where the script, if you are watching it from inside a relationship that has gone quiet, either needs to land or needs to be put down. Because the information is only useful if it changes something. And the thing it needs to change is not a grand gesture. It is not a vacation or a conversation or a therapy appointment, though none of those things hurt. It is something smaller, something that can happen tonight, at whatever table you're sitting at, across from whatever silence you have been living with. Ask the question. And when the one-word answer comes back, which it probably will, because one-word answers become habits, and habits take time to break, do not accept it. Not aggressively, not with accusation, just with a follow-up. Just with a genuine, patient, unhurried curiosity that says, I actually want to know. I'm not asking as a ritual. I'm asking as a person who misses the person across from me and is willing to sit here until something real comes back. That is the Teresa move. That is the Gottman move. That is the oldest move in the history of love. Showing up again, after the silence, without guarantees, without the assurance that the other person will meet you. Just showing up, again, face pointed toward, and waiting with the particular kind of patience that is not passive but is chosen, daily, like a direction, like a commitment, like a prayer that has not yet been answered but is being continued anyway. It does not always work. Teresa would tell you that. Gottman would tell you that. Some relationships have moved too far into contempt for a simple question to reach them. Some silences are not pauses but conclusions, and discernment matters. Not every silent dinner table is a crisis in waiting. Some of them are the evidence of permanent damage that needs a different kind of response entirely. Teresa herself walked away from relationships that were spiritually corrosive. She did it carefully and without cruelty, but she did it. But many silences, perhaps most silences, are not permanent damage. They are the accumulated weight of small neglects, small turnings away, small moments where the bid for connection was made and missed, not out of cruelty, but out of exhaustion, out of preoccupation, out of the ordinary human tendency to manage proximity rather than experience it. Those silences can be broken. Teresa broke hers. Millions of ordinary people, sitting in therapists' offices in Seattle and London and Sao Paulo and Lagos, have broken theirs, not with miracles, with turning, with the daily, unglamorous, irreplaceable act of asking the question and waiting for the real answer. The question was never complex. It was always the same question, asked across every table, every prayer, every moment of human proximity that matters. How was your day? And the answer, if you're brave enough to give a real one, is where it begins again.